Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Workbench. I am Nancy Solomon, Chair of the Labour Committee at HERMAB, and joining me today is Sheena Mayers-Ganville, Executive Director, BEC, and President of the Caribbean Employers Confederation. And we are going to be discussing the foundations of IR and consultation.
Thanks, Nancy. It's my pleasure to join you today as we discuss this interesting topic.
So, Sheena, what does really consultation look like in a labor framework such as ours?
So when you think consultation, at its base, it is about talking, it is about discussion, it is about engaging. So don't get carried away with this concept of consultation. When you think about workplace relations, the foundation of any relationship is communication. So when we talk about consultation, it boils down to communication, discussing with persons, engaging with them, letting them know what is happening, letting them know of upcoming changes, and having dialogue.
Okay, but most times when we hear consultation from many HR practitioners and employers, we always start thinking the other party, not the employees, the union. So, as a head of and the head of a union of your own, of the employers' union, more or less, as if we're going to call it that, how do the trade unions play and what are their role, and how do you see them fitting into the consultation process?
Yes, you're right. When we think about consultation, people start to think, okay, if I have to engage in formal consultation, no, I'm not just talking to my employees, I'm talking to trade unions. But trade unions are the representative of those same employees. Very often, the message that the trade union receives will come from those employees. So your consultation has to start long before your meeting with the trade union. It's about what image, what perception does your employee have of the business and its operations. That's where to start, because that is going to feed into what they express to the trade union, because the trade union is going to be the voice of the workers. They are expressing what the workers have told them. So you need to view it from that point. And then one thing about consultation is you need to be genuine and you need to be open to sharing and also open to listening. Very often, when we engage, we have to listen to what is said, but also what is not said. Sometimes people have underlying concerns that they have not expressed clearly. Maybe they don't even understand it themselves. So you have to listen to what are the major concerns that your employees have and seek to address those.
Okay, so we've spoken about the employees, we've spoken about the trade unions and the consultation process. You've touched a little on the employers, but what about the legal framework? Where does the law fit into this entire role of consultation?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Nancy. Yes, there are legal requirements for consultation, but I'm glad we didn't start the conversation there in terms of what's legally required, because I want us to be engaging with our workforce long before we get to what is legally required. So one of the things that comes up most often in terms of legal requirement has to do with the requirement to consult with workers 6 weeks before there are any major redundancies or layoffs. So if more than 10% of your workforce is going to be impacted by layoffs and not layoffs, maybe short time layoff, redundancy, then you have the requirement under the Employment Rights Act to consult at least 6 weeks prior to those things being put into effect.
And does this matter the size of the organization? So if I have like 10 or 20, because a lot of small businesses may be wondering, if I have just 10 or maybe 20 employees.
Yeah, 10% of, when we have 6 employees, 10% is what? 0.6 of an employee, correct. Meaning 1. So the legislation actually does not consider the size of the organization. It simply states 10%. This is something that we at the BC have been advocating that needs to be relooked, because just as you mentioned, our economy is made up of a number of small businesses. So when you are saying a business with 5 employees has to consult when 10% or more are being impacted, that's every single employee. Whereas you may have a larger business and 50 persons may not even be 10%. Would you want consultation in such a scenario? So we have put forward proposals for there to be a numerical number in there as well, a threshold to be considered for consultation.
Okay, so we've been talking about what happens when things go as planned. But what about when consultation breaks down? What then?
So the nature of consultation is around dialogue, and we know that we have that specific legal circumstance where it is required. Interestingly enough, the legislation does not say it must end in agreement. That is actually not specified. It says the employer must consult, but it doesn't indicate what the outcome of that consultation must be. But the intent is you have to have that dialogue. And one of the things as an employer you have to consider is, once I have gone through this process, besides the persons who are being impacted, if they're exiting my organization, you want to make sure they're treated fairly in the process. But you also have to look at what your survivors, your remaining employees, how they feel about the entire process as well. So that's why it's important to approach the consultation in such a manner that you would want at the end of it for employees who remain within your organization, even though they've lost colleagues, would believe that, okay, this was still handled in a fair manner. But the truth is, you're right, sometimes the parties can't come to a meeting of minds. Maybe it might be in terms of how do you choose who's going to be impacted, what factors the company is utilizing, if it's looking at last and first or only, where a company might want to look at performance factors, but the trade union might say, let's look at tenure. There may not be a meeting of minds. But ultimately, as I indicated, the legislation doesn't say that you must come to an agreement, but sometimes the parties might choose to utilize an independent third party, meaning the Labor Department, to get them over that hurdle, to explain, well, this is exactly what the company is doing, that it is a fair approach, and while there may be an alternative request, why it cannot be accommodated or why it might not be in the best interest to be accommodated.
Okay, so you've been alluding to layoffs and that sort of approach in terms of consultation, but consultation can also break down for salary negotiations, for wages, or improvements in conditions as well, correct?
But we don't usually call those consultations. We would call that negotiation.
Okay.
Yes. So when we are negotiating, so that's the other space where we engage with the trade unions, we can have a breakdown in negotiations. I tell people that, the slow, painstaking work of industrial relations, of building up relationships, that's not the sexy part, right? What grabs headlines is when negotiations break down. But very often we are able to discuss at the table and become creative in terms of finding out what the real problem is, because sometimes someone would indicate they have a challenge with maybe it's lunch times or how they're allocated or something like that, and the company is considering maybe staff coverage during that critical period, whereas for the employee the problem may be access to healthy lunches during the period. So while the conversation might seem it's about time, really and truly there are other interests that are feeding the narrative. And what's important is to find out what it is that the person genuinely wants and if that can be accommodated.
Okay. All right. So can you give me maybe an example of where the collaboration between the employer representative and maybe the union would have possibly allowed for the avoidance of a breakdown or conflict situation that you may have seen rising?
Definitely. I can think of a number of situations, but the first one that comes to mind, I can see that in that particular situation, I think there was a level of trust that existed in the relationship. And building on the past experiences and the trust is what fostered the ability for us to meet and solve the problem quickly. So just to bring some context, I had a situation where a particular department in a company, manufacturing company, they had a grievance, and they felt as though they raised it with the company and that there was no response, and therefore they went to their union representation to bring it to the company, and they filed an official grievance. So that was submitted formally to the company. The company in response was very surprised that they had this grievance submitted to them, because from the company's perspective, you had raised something with us and we were actively working on it. So then why is this now coming to us as a formal grievance?
Understood.
But when we met, because in speaking to the company, they said this is not how we operate. So let's meet with the union and see what is really driving this. So when we met and the employees outlined their grievances, their concerns, the company was able to articulate, well, yes, you did tell us this. And there are a number of moving parts, things that the employees did not know of, external vendors and suppliers that the company had to meet with and work with as they tried to solve the problem. So from the employee's perspective, we had raised this with you, you didn't tell us anything. The company was saying, we have been actively working on it, and it's not as simple a solution that you thought it would be.
So this is where the communication comes in now again.
Yes, because very often employees, they only see their aspect. They see the parts that they're involved in. But management sometimes has a completely different viewpoint, and not sometimes, most of the time, because they're the ones who are seeing a bigger picture. And employees sometimes don't know all of the intricacies that are involved in managing a situation. But keeping them in the loop is one way to prevent matters from escalating. So in this particular situation, even as we met, we walked away, smiling, because even though the employees felt aggrieved, even though they came to the meeting and they had filed a formal grievance, they did acknowledge within the meeting, I think what surprised them is it took so long, because that has not been their experience with the company. Mm-hmm. So once the company was able to explain what was going on, they simply said, but we didn't know, and we know that you don't take so long to fix grievances, and we were able to discuss that.
Okay, so let's look at the flip side. What has been the impact of ignoring this brewing conflict, ignoring the consultation, ignoring that communication? In your experience, what has that led to?
So definitely when you engage early, it can resolve problems and put them to bed quickly. But if they are ignored, then you can have a brewing situation within your organization. And if you continue to ignore it or not handle it effectively, you can end up with industrial dislocation. Industrial dislocation is what we know as the sick outs, we know as the work rules, we know as the final thing in terms of strikes. The intent is to avoid all of that. Sometimes it might not be avoidable, especially where we are talking about negotiations and there are serious interests at stake, and therefore it's critical for persons have taken particular positions that they find hard to move from. But the aim of industrial relations is to avoid industrial dislocation. So you don't want to get to a stage where there are strikes and where there's industrial disharmony. So the intent is to engage early, to engage often, and to engage in open and good faith dialogue. That is what fosters trust, and that trust helps to solve problems even before they escalate.
All right, so thank you very much, Sheena, for joining us here and for providing some useful information as it relates to the role of collaboration, not just for big businesses, but for everyone that has an employment relationship, and the pitfalls to avoid, and where you can work well with not just the employees, but also the trade unions in resolving any potential conflicts. So I want to thank you again for joining us here on the Workbench, where we break down workplace issues and build up insights.